In a similar way to the Pennzoil Skyline, which I reviewed a couple of days ago on the channel, and even as far back as my very first GT7 car review, which was the Alpha 155, this is another one of those hugely important, massively fan favourite returning faces from Gran Turismo's past. The interesting thing about the CLK-LM though, which as some of you will remember used to be inaccurately called the CLK GTR in some of the older games, is that I would actually argue, maybe controversially, that the bar is actually not as high on this one as it is with something like the Alfa Romeo or the Nissan, because think of it this way, the Nissan legitimately is one of the best GT500s in the older games. The Alpha 155 is one of the best touring cars. The CLK-LM, although a pleasure to work with, was most definitely not among the absolute fastest of Le Mans cars, or just endurance prototypes overall within Gran Turismo's history. In fact, the very first car review series that I did on this channel years ago, back in the Potato Cam days, was called Spirit of Le Mans. Some of you might even remember it, and this was a car that I talked about. It's good, but it's no way near something like a 787B or a Pescarolo, or of course its own brethren, the Sauber C9. Now the Sauber is still in the game, and with a price tag, thanks to Hagerty, of 6.5 million credits, which, let's be frank here, should not be the price on this car. That is ridiculous. Historical, importance aside, I don't care. It's not worth 6.5 million, and that's just a fact. You might love the car enough to buy it, but saying that this is worth almost 3 times what a Mazda 787B is, or a Nissan R92CP, etc., it simply isn't on an actual performance level. But what about within its category? Because one of the other potentially controversial things about the LM is it's a Group 2 car. Now the stock points on this are 830, it actually comes with medium tyres instead of the usual hards, so I swapped those to hards for this event, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, so the points that I'm running here are actually lower than stock. Now with that in mind, the reason why I did that is both to more accurately feel what the car is like most of the time, since many of us do race with hards, but also to more accurately compare it to other race cars that I've reviewed with those same hard tyres. So what is this thing actually like? Because it was never a premium car before. It did not have the detailed interior, it still had like the Gran Turismo 4 era graphics, and the biggest change in terms of performance is a very significant one: the weight. This car used to weigh 1 metric ton, which is 1,000 kilos. Now it weighs 940. A huge difference. 60 kilos might not sound like much, but once you get into that kind of sub-ton territory for a prototype, that's quite the considerable difference, and it's not too far off even some of the modern LMP machines. Now in terms of performance, you'll see toward the end of this event that I'm up around the 190 mile an hour region, at least before you do anything to it in terms of gearing or aero, and for those curious, of course you can upgrade it, you can get way more power out of it thanks to the turbo setup, and the top speed can of course exceed 200 easily. But what about in terms of how it performs around a track? What's the handling like? What's the cornering? What's the manners of the vehicle? Well, curiously, and I guess this is a testament to the older games more than anything, it actually feels kind of reminiscent of what it used to be like. In fact, the way I have always thought of the LM, and I don't recall if I said this years ago, but I think I probably did, is that to me, out of all of the endurance prototypes in the series, the CLK-LM feels the most like driving a really, really fast touring car, like a squashed version of the CLK DTM. Whereas all the others are much more aggressive, much more precise, much more jittery, 787B, Sauber, etc. Many of those are very, very fast and much faster than the LM, but the LM felt very adept at long races. It was very low effort, super smooth, very forgiving, very easy to drive, and it just felt like a nice car to work with. They've actually carried that over. It still feels like a very low stress, excellent long distance endurance car. However, it's not perfect. My biggest gripe about the LM, at least in its stock form, is that when you do throw this thing around a really technical, ultra high speed circuit such as the Nürburgring, the car has this what I would call roll-on understeer. And what I mean by that is when you dive into the corner, it's very good. Partway through the corner, it's still really good, but then as you roll onto that throttle and accelerate out of the corner, it will often become really heavy and get a really bad, wide turning circle as you exit the corner, and it feels very different to how many of the other, Group C GT1s feel. Many of those have a great turn-in, and they have the exact opposite problem, wherein they tend to be more oversteery and step the tail out. This almost feels like it's closer to being a front mid-engine car sometimes, like a Panos LMP1 Roadster or an Esperante GTR1, which of course are among my favourites, but it's not really what you'd expect from this car. It still feels almost like it weighs 1,000 kilos, in a funny kind of way. Now overall, it's not a killer. Of course, tuning can do wonders to a car, and overall, it's a very, very cool car to use at the 800 point level. I think it just has a couple of gripes. One of them is that handling, which again shouldn't be too much of an issue. As you can see in this event, I did win overall, spoiler alert, and as you'll have seen from my gameplay footage on Dragon Trail just blasting the car around the track, it is a very composed machine. And that, for the most part, is how I would describe this car. Extremely composed, to its credit. The biggest downside is easily, though, that price. Nostalgia is a huge factor here for any of us who justify paying $6.5 million for it, because if we're honest about it, if this were a car that had never been featured in the series in the past, you probably wouldn't be anywhere near as willing to pay that kind of money for it, especially compared to the other far more iconic and sometimes more successful Group C cars, for example. So for me, that is the biggest drawback, so you really have to decide whether or not the nostalgia and the personal preference is high enough for you to pour that kind of money into the car. It's not necessarily that it's too difficult to earn that kind of cash. A couple of circuit experiences and races at Le Mans, you'll get it in no time. It's more the principle of the thing. So that's it for my thoughts on the LM. Give me yours down below. Do you love it? Do you maybe not like it? I could see it being a car that might be a bit controversial on the handling side. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.